Thank you very much, Thea. Thank you so much for the invitation to present here today. We are delighted to be with you, and we wished we could have been with you in person, which was our original plan. Um, we are going to talk about our book, which grew out of a series of papers that we wrote, and all of this work has been funded by the National Institutes of Health through the NBER. To start, just to give a sense of what's happening, it's good to go back to the 20th century and see what happened then. But the themes of our book, the themes of our book are that even before the arrival of COVID, the lives of Americans with less than a bachelor's degree, which are about 2/3 of the population between the ages of 25 and 64, were coming apart. And in the book, we document what that means in terms of despair and excess mortality. And we discuss some of the long run forces we think are at work. So if we go back to the 20th century, which was a time of enormous progress in technology, progress in health, for example, and what you're looking at here is the mortality rate for whites between the ages of 45 and 54 between 1900 and 1999. You can see the spike with the flu pandemic of 1918. And you can see, if you look, kind of a plateau around 1960, when people who were then in their 40s or 50s, who had smoked very heavily in their 20s and 30s and 40s, were dying of lung cancer and heart disease. But then two things happened. There was behavioral change. People stopped smoking in big numbers. And there was also medical advance that very efficient, inexpensive antihypertensives came on the market, which helped people control their blood pressure. Heart disease progress continued, and we saw mortality rates continue to fall. So these death rates are deaths per 100,000 people. And all the death rates we're going to show you today are measured in that way. And you can just think about them as the risk of dying in any particular year. So we thought that that kind of progress was just going to always continue. And you can see that in countries that kind of sort of look like the US, other English-speaking countries, the wealthy countries of Europe, that mortality rates continue to fall at 2% per year from around 1990 to the most recent data that we have for those countries. But the US left the herd. If you look what happened in the United States, for white non-Hispanics, that's the red line on top there, that looked a lot like Germany until the late 1990s, mortality rates started to rise. They flatlined at best. Some years they rise, but they certainly are not falling, and they certainly are not falling any longer at 2% a year. For Hispanics, which is the thick blue line that entered the graph, they look a lot like Brits. So that mortality rates for Hispanics fell, mortality rates for non-Hispanic Blacks, which are higher than whites, that continue to be higher at whites, but their mortality rates were falling at 2.6% a year over this period. And so when we looked at this, it looked like the group that really needed us to drill into this were what was happening to white mortality. And part of that is that our progress against heart disease slowed down, which we can come back to. But the three kinds of deaths whose rates rose and rose rapidly were deaths from drug overdose, from suicide, and from alcoholic liver disease. And you'll see in the pictures that we've drawn here, we've divided it between people with less than a bachelor's degree and people with a bachelor's degree or more. And there's just this profound increase for people without a BA, whereas for people with a BA, there's a small increase in drug overdose deaths. Even in our bubbles, we know someone who's had a brother or a sister or a mother who's had a problem with opioids, but it's nothing compared to what's been happening for people without a bachelor's degree. So it turns out that starting in 1989, education was added to death certificates. And by the early 1990s, most states were compliant in putting it on the death certificates. So our BA, non-BA distinction goes back to about 1992. And from that time to now, you can see that mortality rates started to rise. And it turns out that a BA, not BA is a meaningful dividing line in mortality, but also in a lot of other dysfunctions that occurred in the US starting at least as far back as the 1990s. There's been very little change in the fraction of Americans getting a BA or not a BA, whereas at other levels of education, there has been change. And so you might worry about selection into a group. Whereas for BA, not BA, that's been pretty stable over this period. Now these graphs are just for people aged 45 to 54. But if you look at what happens to people at all ages in prime of life, from 25 to 29, which is the upper left-hand corner, 60 to 64-year-olds are the middle right, and even into the newly elderly, the 65 to 69-year-olds, what you see is the split between what's happening with a BA and what's happening without a BA. So this is not just like a middle-age problem or a baby boomer problem. And once those baby boomers exit stage right, suddenly everything's going to be okay. This is something that is happening to people as young as their late 20s. In 2018, there were 158,000 deaths in America from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. That's up from 65,000 deaths in 1995. So that excess mortality, upwards of 100,000 deaths per year, puts it on the same scale as what we worry about COVID deaths being possibly this year. Except that these deaths from drugs and alcohol and suicide happen every year, and they're probably most likely going to continue to happen after there's a vaccine or there are treatments for COVID. So this is another epidemic taking place, but it's mostly taking place under the radar because it's taking place for people without a bachelor's degree. We find it helpful in our work, instead of looking at age groups, instead to look at this by the year people were born. So what we see here for people without a bachelor's degree is what's the risk of dying from one of these deaths if you were born in 1940? That's the navy blue line at the bottom there. What's the risk if you were born in 45 or 50 or 1955? And what you can see is that every successive birth cohort faces a higher risk of dying from one of these causes. So if you look at around age 45, for the people born in 1945, their risk was lower than people born in 50, lower than the people born in 1955, and so on. So there's been this dramatic increase. We could draw these separately for drugs, for alcohol, and for suicide, and we see this same pattern for each of those causes of death. We tend to bin those together, and as a shorthand, we started calling them deaths of despair, just because it's easier than keep saying suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease. But the media picked up on it, and it seemed to have touched a nerve. So they became deaths of despair, but for us, it's just a description of the deaths taking place. They're all death by one's own hand. Suicide is a bit different from drug overdose or dying from alcoholic liver disease. Some of the people dying from those latter causes may not have been trying to kill themselves. Some of them might have been, but they all can be recognized as deaths that come from despair. So this is what it looks like for people without a bachelor's degree. If you compare it to people with a bachelor's degree, it looks like they live in different universes. There's a small increase among people with a bachelor's degree in the youngest birth cohorts here, but it's nothing like what we're seeing for people without a BA. So Durkheim, who wrote on suicide back at the end of the 1900s, and we reached all the way back to Durkheim because what he talked about is as relevant today as it was when he wrote, is that suicide is more likely in times of great upheaval, when there's less social integration, for example. Those could be upheaval because things are going very well or things are going very poorly, but upheaval seems to be one of the root causes. So who is dying? That's the first thing we really needed to dig into. Yeah, yeah. And both men and women are dying these deaths of despair. The press oftentimes will write accurately in the body of a news article that it's men and women, but the headline writers tend to say white men dying. And we think that might be because they can't imagine that women could kill themselves in these ways. And if you go back far enough in the day, women really didn't kill themselves in these ways, but that's changed. The increases for men and women without a BA have been almost identical. Um, so it is something that's hitting men and women in almost equal numbers. I wanted to remind myself to ask you, can you find the Great Recession in this picture? Because what we see is a smooth, steady increase up over time. And when we dig into the data, what we find is that it's not concurrent economic conditions that seem to be responsible for these deaths. It's not the current unemployment rate or the current income level. And we think that it has much deeper, older roots. And that's what we went digging for. Where is it happening? In every state. If you take age-adjusted mortality rates for whites between the ages of 25 and 64, and you ask what happened between the turn of the century and the most recent data we've got available, which come from 2018, in every state, alcoholic liver disease mortality rose, suicide rose, and drug overdoses rose as well. Although classifying the drug overdoses is like shooting at a moving target. It started as a prescription opioid epidemic, but that moved into a heroin epidemic and most recently into a much deadlier epidemic of street fentanyl taking people out. And it's happening at all levels of urbanization. Big cities, that's the blue line on top, and you can see the death rate from these causes rising from 40 to 100. Suburban areas, that would be the gray line at the bottom, but also rising with time. What's gotten a lot of attention are rural areas, that's the red line. And yes, we see it rising in rural areas, but it looks like it's pretty much with the pack. It doesn't look like it's especially different, but it is rising with the others. And in the book, we document that underneath these mortality counts, there has been a dramatic increase in pain and poor mental health among people without a bachelor's degree, and basically no change in reports of pain or diminished mental health among people with a BA. But reporting pain or self-reports on one's ability to make one's way through life and negotiate life, because they're self-reports, they're easier to dismiss. But we think when you combine those with the increases in mortality, they fit into a larger picture, and it's much harder to dismiss the number of people who are dying. Where does this come from? We think that the long-term labor market decline for less educated workers has a lot to do with this story, and that you need to go back all the way to the 1970s. We don't think necessarily that material welfare is the direct cause, but with a lack of a stable job, good job, it brings a loss of community, of marriage, of meaning, of status in life. And we think it is those effects that people like Andy Cherlin or Bob Putnam have written about very well, help us to better understand why these might lead to larger deaths from these causes. The labor market decline, if you look at men aged 25 to 54 without a bachelor's degree, you can see that the median wages have been on long-term decline at least as far back as 1979. The wages rise and fall with the economy, but there has been this long-term decline in wages. And what was celebrated before COVID of this increase in wages that were coming to people without a bachelor's degree or working class wages, yes, wages were rising, but they were nowhere even near the wages that people had before the Great Recession. And at the same time, people have left the labor force. So if you look at the employment to population ratio for men 25 to 64 without a BA in the right-hand panel here, the little red vertical lines show recession years. And you can see that people lose their jobs during recessions. And then over time, they regain employment, but it never reaches the same height it was prior to the previous recession. So there's been this ratcheting downward in attachment to the labor force for prime-aged men. So both of these things then being kind of the fuel that kept working class life going, having a good job, a job with prospects, falling for this group. There's little wage change within a job, lower wages and lower labor force participation come from losing jobs and replacing jobs. And a lot of the jobs that are replaced are now coming from outsourced companies. You're not working for a major hotel company, you're working for a transport company or a security company or the Albright Cleavey company, where there's a lot less commitment from either the employer or the employees. And it's a lot harder for those jobs to be seen as part of a good life. Even low-skilled workers could see themselves as belonging to a large company, much less so if they're working for an outsourced company. What happens, which our friends in sociology told us about many years ago, was that working class people weren't getting married at the rates they used to get married. And why? Well, they would report that if you don't have a good job, people decide to cohabit, but not to get married. So these cohabitations in the US are quite fragile. We might have a child, then we split up, I repartner, you repartner. You might not see the child you had with me because that child's now living with someone else. So fragile home life, fragile work life, decline in community, all being kind of a Durkheimian recipe for suicide. This is what it looks like in terms of marriage rates falling for whites without a BA. So back in 1980, this is age along the x-axis and fraction married along the y-axis. In 1980, people with and without a BA were equally likely to be married. For both groups, there was a decline between 80 and 90, but for people without a BA, that decline just kept coming, so that home life is not as stable. And in the book, we argue that what's happening to the white working class, in many respects, not all, but in many respects, mirror what happened to African Americans beginning in the 1960s, when industry left the inner cities. When industry left the inner cities and the Fair Housing Act allowed better educated, higher skilled African Americans to leave more dangerous neighborhoods, marriage rates fell, out of wedlock childbearing increased. There was a crack cocaine epidemic. Here there's the prescription opioid epidemic. But it looks like it's just another turn of the wheel. And this time it's coming for the white working class. So many of the arguments that people make about Black culture, going back all the way to the Moynihan report, at the center of the tangle of pathology is the weakness of the family structure, are now being made about the white working class. So Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, you could basically just cross out what he says about whites and write in Blacks, and that would have been his book, about what happened to the Black working class in the 1970s. Now, we think that Charles Murray's argument that white males are less industrious than they once had been isn't supported by the data. In the picture I just showed you, there was decline in wages and decline in employment, which does not sound like a supply shift in. It sounds more like a demand shift in to us. And that if it was just that people became less industrious, we should have seen some people leave the labor force, but wages should have risen and instead they fell. So there was cumulative distress in many, many areas: suicide, chronic pain, difficulty socializing, mental distress, heavy drinking, higher obesity rates, lack of marriage, leaving the labor force. Half of white working class adults are not affiliated with any religion. Now, in the US, religion has always been an incredibly important institution. It provided solace in times of great pain and people that would help to support others when the times were rough. So that is also another pillar that's been eroded away over time here. So obviously, labor markets were weakened by globalization and automation. But that's been true in all rich countries who haven't seen deaths of despair rise. So what's different about the US? So two things especially come to mind for us. The first being that we allowed there to be a prescription opioid epidemic. The despair, we argue in the book, preceded the opioids, that the rates were rising prior to the arrival of OxyContin in 1996. But the fact that hundreds of millions of pills were shipped to small towns for resale over this period made the crisis a lot more horrific than it would have been otherwise. And the opioids, we claim, landed on ground that was fertile for abuse. So what else is different about the US? Do you want to take over?
No, go
on. The other thing that we think is different about the US is our healthcare. I call it a healthcare industry. It's not really a system in the sense that it is so dysfunctional and so chaotic and so patched together. It's hard to call it a system, but the healthcare industry, we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, but on many metrics, we have the worst health in the rich world. Our life expectancy is lower than any other rich countries. We argue that life expectancy fell not in spite of what we spend on healthcare, but because of what we spend on healthcare. And here's where we like to connect the dots. That the spending on healthcare, which went from 5% of GDP in 1960 to 18% of GDP in 2019, is eating the American economy from the inside out. And if you compare what's happened in the US to other rich countries, it provides a useful example here. So this is expenditure on healthcare per capita from 1970 to 2015 in the United Kingdom. So you can see life expectancy rising for most of that period. There was a bad flu year in there when it went flat. Healthcare expenditure rising as well. With all of these, 1970 will be the lower left corner and 2015 will be the upper right corner. So there's the UK. We can add to that Australia, which looks a lot like the UK. Here's Canada, a little more expensive, but also in the same neighborhood. France, the same. If you add in Switzerland, which is the next most expensive healthcare system after the US, the Swiss live 5 years longer than Americans live. Their healthcare is expensive, but it's also expensive relative to Europe, but not necessarily relative to the US. Here's what we looked like between 1970 and 1982. If you bring it into 1990, and then if you bring it into 2015. So you can see that we are well off the curve in terms of how much we spend on health care and the outcomes for us being worse than in other rich countries. It would be a harder possibly thing to argue if our life expectancy and our health was much better than other countries, but that's not the case. The difference in terms of the fraction of GDP that we spend on healthcare relative to what the Swiss spend is 5% of spending. That's more than $1 trillion a year. You can get that $1 trillion mark summing up from the bottom to the top, or this way, which is basically if we were spending that fraction of GDP, what would it look like? That's more than $8,300 a household. And that's just excess spending. That's not spending on healthcare, that's just the waste. That comes out of wages, of profits, of taxes. People tend to think that their employer-provided healthcare is a gift, but that gift is being deducted in part or in whole from what would be in a paycheck. And many firms that face their share of what is now a $21,000 a year premium for a family policy decide that that worker isn't worth it to them, and they decide to outsource those jobs. So that's one of the reasons why these jobs that are available are not jobs that are connected to a ladder up, that are not connected to a large company. It's also the case state and local governments have to pay their share of Medicaid, and the spending on Medicaid, which has exploded as well with the cost of healthcare. I mean, there's less for infrastructure, there's less for once great state university systems, so that it's hurting us in that domain as well. We know that we need to look more also at corporations. Post-World War II, the US had very little competition, and rents were shared with workers, most famously in the Treaty of Detroit. And the firms provided social protection, healthcare, and pensions. Those things are largely provided by the state in Europe. But after first competition came in from Germany and Japan, and now full-on globalization, these firms can no longer provide social protection. And privately provided social protection is no longer functional for American workers. And we think that really, really needs to be rethought. So what do we do with all of this? We believe in capitalism. I mean, when you see capitalism, Angus has a famous book in which he documents how capitalism brought hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty around the world. It's a powerful force, but it needs to be reined in. We think it needs to be fixed here. It needs to be made fairer, but we don't think it needs to be abandoned. Healthcare reform is, we think, first among equals here. In Attlee's cabinet in Great Britain, right after World War II, when they started the National Health Service, when the health minister was asked how he got the doctors on board for a national health service, he famously said, "I stuffed their mouths with gold." We may need to pay off these large, voracious parts of the healthcare system, and then slowly over time recover what we've paid them. We also think antitrust needs to be revised and rethought. For example, in the healthcare industry, where hospital mergers, someone has been asleep at the switch and hasn't seemed to notice that when hospitals merge, on average, prices don't go down as one might expect. If there were synergies, prices go up. We need a better safety net. We're not supporters for the US to have a UBI. There are very good arguments, but they're not necessarily good arguments for the US. And we can talk about that if you'd like. We need a better safety net. Open countries tend to have larger governments that can buffer them from the demands that being in a globalized world bring. the BA, no BA split and the importance of that. Do we think more people should go to college? We think everyone who can go to college, who wants to go to college, certainly should. But we think that what's happening to education now is that K through 12 education is focused primarily on the minority of students who are college bound. And the rest of the students don't get the kind of training they need for the 21st century jobs that they might be eligible for. We also think that if you look at the lobbying and the campaign finance, workers, less educated workers are not represented in Washington. The healthcare industry has 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress. It's powerful enough that something that the left and the right agreed upon in December 2019, which was to eliminate surprise medical billing from emergency departments and ambulances that had been purchased by private equity. And people were presented with medical bills, even if the hospital was in their network. Sorry, the emergency room you entered in is not in your network, and your bills can run to the many thousands of dollars. Everybody thought that that was a scandal. It got stripped from the final bill when very powerful hospitals leaned on important members of Congress. So it's possible that the COVID crisis may give us an opportunity for healthcare reform. That remains to be seen. So that's where we're going to leave it, Thea.
That is great. Thank you so much, Anne and Angus, for that presentation. I can tell from the chat box and the Q&A that you have really sparked a lot of questions and interesting thoughts, and we will get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. And I have a couple of my own as well. So I'm going to start with my questions, taking the prerogative of the chair. So first of all, you tie the rise in deaths of despair to longstanding economic trends and policy shifts that EPI has been highlighting for many years. The wage stagnation and inequality, the deterioration in job quality, and the basically abdication by many employers of some of their traditional responsibilities in terms of healthcare and the employment relationship, the decline in union membership, and the rise in corporate power, so that imbalance of power between workers and companies, the rise in corporate globalization and outsourcing, and of course, the sorry state of American healthcare, and to some extent also social safety nets. So those are all issues that, that we've talked about for a long time and that we have bemoaned. But you also talk about cultural shifts, about religion, marriage, the family, and social circles. Can you talk about the interplay between the economic changes and the cultural changes, and how you see the direction of causality between those two?
That's really hard. I think we proclaim at one point in the book that we like to think of causality as more like historians think of causality, with they all feedback on each other. And so trying to think for one single monocausal relationship is sort of hard. And, you know, this was a situation which globalization made the world much more competitive. It made it much harder for employers to accept their traditional role in providing the safety net. And in fact, we think that the great shame in America is that, unlike other European countries who took this stuff into government, you know, at some point after the Second World War, the US has never managed to do that. And, you know, a lot of that was sustainable when the world was a lot less competitive place and there were many less robots, if you like, or ways of replacing labor, but it's become increasingly untenable. So the big difference here with Europe is that a lot of that social safety net is provided privately. And of course, we argue in the book it was a catastrophe. COVID's making even more of a catastrophe. Because if you have mass unemployment or something through a pandemic, then, you know, the state has to scramble to do this, and it's not very good at doing it because that's not part of the general social contract we have here. And I think that's fed slowly. I mean, many people want to see, you know, they say, you can't be right because here was the Great Recession and none of this happened then. And it's just a slow trickle in which, you know, the lives that working class people had have been slowly taken away from them by the accumulation of these forces, and without there being a proper safety net and, you know, all the rest of what we decline. But this healthcare thing is, you know, we can disagree about how much you want to do about globalization and how much you want to do about automation, but this is a horrible self-inflicted wound that we're imposing on ourselves. And we think of the healthcare system as a huge engine of inequality that's taking away from working people and giving to a very well-funded healthcare system.
Great, thank you. So the second question, this is maybe a follow-up on that. You focus, of course, and you explain exactly why on the white working class. And yet many of the economic trends that you identify are also impacting communities of color.
Yes.
And Sandy Darity, who's on the call, put in a question there, which is, you know, the difference between white people in the United States who look like a developed country and Black people. If you look at the statistics in terms of life expectancy and health outcomes and so on, they look like they're living in another country to some extent. But why is it, if economic factors are causal, why aren't African-American middle-aged men, for example, similarly affected by those trends?
Well, they are, and they were, and we certainly don't want to claim that this is exclusively something that's only happening to whites. And we have, I think it's chapter 5 in the book, tries to explain that, you know, in some sense, the Blacks got this first, African Americans, you know, and it wasn't a good thing to get this first. This was a really bad thing, right? And it came from them first because, you know, with the first wave of globalization, and African Americans were probably the least skilled in the population, but then it moved on, it caused all this social destruction and thing there. And then it's moved up to the next least skilled, which are white people without a college degree. So we see this as a sort of continuous process that's affected everybody. It's true about life expectancy, and there's still a big gap there between Blacks and whites. But in many of the other indicators we look at in the book, it's surprising the big distinction in many cases now is between people who have a BA and people who don't have a BA. And within those groups, in many cases, African Americans are doing as well or better than whites, not on everything, but there's this sense in which there's a move away from race towards class, not entirely, but on many features of well-being. I mean, if you look at other various happiness measures we look at, the stress measures and so on, all of those, for all of those, African Americans actually do better than whites, conditional on BA. So the big problem there is that many fewer African Americans get a BA than do whites.
Yeah, and that the education gap, of course, has narrowed over many years between Blacks and whites.
But it's
one of the things, yeah, I mean, EPI does some of the, we break down the Black woman with a BA who does not quite as well as a white man with just some college. And so a lot of interesting trends there, but and I actually want to talk about the BA because I see there were a couple of questions about, you use the bachelor's degree as a proxy for class, for working class versus more elite. And a couple of questions that came up in the chat box. Michael asked, does it matter if it's a BA in liberal arts or something else? And Gilda asked, what is the BA standing in for? Is it income potential? Is it acculturation? And I had another question too, which is that we are now seeing that wage stagnation and inequality trends are even impacting people with a bachelor degree. So increasingly, recent college graduates are taking jobs that do not require a bachelor degree. And we also see, when we look at the 10-year forecast from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that much of the new job creation doesn't actually require a BA. So BA is symbolic, clearly, you know, of class status. But can you just talk a little bit more about how and why you chose the BA and what it means?
Well, there's a crude answer to that question, which is it's on the death certificate, right? And we can't tell whether
it's a liberal arts or STEM.
Or STEM. We just don't know. We'd love to know that, but we don't. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think there's been a lot of questions about coroners putting those on the death certificates as they are, let alone finding out what sort of BA it is. So there's just a very practical answer to that question. And yes, of course, it's standing in for something else. But you don't want to completely dismiss the idea that there are some jobs which require a BA and some jobs which don't require a BA. But it's way, way over the top in the sense that America has sort of valorized this BA, non-BA distinction in a way that's just not true in other countries. And it's a crazy, as I think Anne said in the presentation, 2/3 of people don't go to college, and yet the whole school system is dedicated to the third that go to college and spends very little time preparing the other people for useful things in life. And of course, the story you just told, which is true, we agree with, is that increasingly people with a BA are being threatened by these things too. And this is the story that we sort of told with the African Americans first, and then the less skilled whites, and then the more skilled whites. And capitalism is just shedding its least productive, least valuable workers as we go along the way. And so capitalism is working for these educated elite, and it's just not working for anyone else. And the danger is that educated elite is going to get smaller and smaller and eliter and eliter. And this is not happening in Europe to the same extent, where educational qualifications are not quite so clear cut. I mean, there's some of it happening everywhere, but it's not as fierce as it is here.
If you look at like David Otter's work at MIT, right, and he talks about the hollowing out of those jobs that used to be filled by people who did not have a bachelor's degree, and that they are not eligible for those jobs anymore, right? So there has been this shift, as you say, but it's those people as well who are finding it very hard to get married, to have a stable home life, to be part of a larger whole. I mean, Americans take a lot of pride in the work that they do. And if you take that away, you've taken away something that is very important to their sense of self as well.
Yeah. We did investigate whether it was a BA or a 3-year college degree or a 2-year college degree. The 2-year, you're a little better off with a 2-year college degree, but it's much closer to just high school than the BA is.
And also a lot more people were getting a 2-year college degree, and we didn't want to have to worry that there was selection into that group over time if that group is getting bigger. Whereas with BA, not BA, it was pretty much 2/3, 1/3 over this whole period. So it made it cleaner.
I think that's surprising to many people who think that the numbers might be a little bit different. Actually, I want to follow up on that last point that you made, Anne, about the dignity of work, because I think that's a really important concept about, you talk about the severe emotional consequences when people are basically no longer able to take the same kind of pride in their work. And I want to talk about the role of unions, which, as we can see, is especially important during this pandemic, where with employer-provided health care, paid leave, personal protective equipment, health and safety, even a political voice, that unions have been very important in counterbalancing the growing power and wealth of corporations and the wealthy. Do you think that the pandemic will revive an interest in and appreciation for the role of unions and the value of unions going forward?
It would be nice. I do think there'll be a switch towards more collectivism and away from this idea that everything can be entrusted to the market. And we've spent so much time worrying about healthcare and the number of the number of lobbyists it has in Washington, and the declining power of the unions is felt nowhere more than that. And it's sort of like this thing that there's just all these good people who now don't have a powerful voice in Washington at all, which used to be there. But it's also the decline in unions, not just in terms of wages, which is sort of the obvious thing, but also the social life and all the other things that it helped make a collective existence for working people that really isn't there anymore. And I think that's very deeply implicated in this social failure and the suicides and the suicide-like deaths.
So you focus very rightly on the quality of jobs in the book. So with the economic shutdown and the virus, we're now seeing mass unemployment, the loss of employer-provided healthcare on a catastrophic scale. How do you expect the current economic crisis to impact the trajectory of the deaths of despair that you've talked about?
That's a really good, very hard question to answer. Probably things are not going to get any better over this period. I mean, it's possible that if people saw this as something that we were all in this together, that this was a national crisis. During war times, suicide rates tend to fall, which is a bit surprising, but historically has been true. But social isolation is a risk factor for suicide. So everyone being isolated is probably putting people at risk. There are reports that people are drinking a lot more heavily in isolation. And this is patchwork, but we get reports that drug overdoses are going up in part because with the opioid epidemic, people can use naloxone, which is Narcan, as an antagonist to the opioid and bring people back from an overdose. But it takes someone to be there to help you through this overdose. And so if you're isolated while you're using, there's a much better chance that you will accidentally overdose as well. So we think that we won't know for a long time. Unlike the COVID numbers, these numbers won't be released for at least a year, probably longer, but we think it's probably not going to be good news for these people.
And there's an obvious point, which you sort of almost made in your question, which is, you know, the people who are at risk of deaths of despair are among the people, they're not the only people, but, you know, they've been treated badly for 50 years. And now they're in this situation where their lives are at risk, or their livelihoods are at risk, or their health insurance is at risk. And, you know, this educated elite like us, you know, we can sit at home and look into our Zoom screens all day, shelter safely. We're probably more productive than we've ever been, and we get paid. You know, so it's certainly widening this gap between the people who were subject to deaths of despair. But it's not a white problem here. I mean, this is a problem for all working people.
Right.
And in fact, you know, there's quite a lot of evidence that African Americans are suffering particularly during this epidemic, which has not been true until 2013 for opioids, for example. So it's not the same thing, and you can't just extrapolate, but it's like a double whammy for a lot of these people.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot of the issues that you raise about healthcare, paid leave, or the tattered social safety net, the weaknesses that we have been allowing through policy to grow for many years are now really exacerbated and laid bare.
Yeah, but we're a little worried that the focus on, you know, losing healthcare, which is a terrible, terrible problem. We don't want to minimize that for a minute, but an employment-based healthcare system is nuts. And it's, you know, in one piece we wrote, we said it's taking a wrecking ball to the labor market. That's even before COVID came along. But it's just a disaster to expect, you know, low-wage workers effectively to pay out of their wage, whether they think they're paying it or not, a $10,000 or $20,000 healthcare premium. I mean, in civilized countries, which sometimes the U.S. is not, you know, we share the cost of healthcare in proportion to how much we earn, and not as what is effectively a poll tax on everybody, where everybody pays the same amount no matter how much you're capable of earning.
Yeah, I like this quote from your book, that the healthcare system is a uniquely American calamity that is undermining American lives. And that is shown to be very true today. So I have a question from Larry Michel, who's the former president of EPI, my predecessor. So he's, Angus, he says, in your earlier book, The Great Escape, you said, the question people asked changed from how can I be saved when they were looking to satisfy a higher authority to how can I be happy when they questioned authority and rebelled. And that showed up in the 1960s in civil rights, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and more recently in Parkland, Florida. From what you learned, and this is for both of you, of course, in writing Deaths of Despair, what can be done for people to stop trying to find an authority figure like Donald Trump to save them and learn to question authority and take responsibility for their own happiness by rebelling? So that's from Larry Michel.
I thought they did rebel by electing Donald Trump. I mean, it's, in some sense, there were a lot of people, you know, we're often asked about this because many of the people we delineate were people who voted for Donald Trump. And, you know, they're the people who have been who've done very badly over a long period of time. They don't seem to be well represented. They don't have unions anymore. The Democratic Party seems to have abandoned working class people, and has formed an alliance between the educated elite and the minorities. And the Republicans are not going to represent these people. So we do need a political realignment, I think, which gets a real voice for working class people again.
I couldn't agree more with that. So there's a question here. Do you see a difference in deaths of despair in red versus blue states?
If you look we broke the U.S. into 1,000 small regions, each with at least 100,000 people in them. And if you look at these deaths of despair and votes for Donald Trump, what you find is that where Donald Trump did well is where the deaths were highest. So rather than it being a red state, blue state, it's really happening throughout the country. There are only very small regions of the country, the upper Midwest, for example, where there was little change. But basically, the rest of the country has seen this happen, red state, blue state.
Two quick comments. I mean, one is despair is driving blue states into red states, or driving what were once reliably blue areas into red areas. The other thing that people don't say very much, but it's really true, is 80% of COVID deaths so far are in blue states. This is a curse that's been brought on the blue states from wherever it came from. And half the governors are Democrats, half the governors are Republicans, and 80% of the COVID deaths as of last week, when I last tabulated them, are in states with a Democratic governor.
There's a question here. The Great Escape and other books focus on income inequality, but wealth inequality is even more extreme. And in retirement, wealth is more important. So the question is, why do so many books ignore wealth inequality?
I don't think they ignore it. I just think that wealth inequality is a consequence of income inequality. And from arguments that I know mathematically, but have never been able to put in its popular form, it's sort of an automatic consequence that because income lasts over time and wealth accumulates, you're always in any system going to get more wealth inequality than income inequality, which is not to say that it doesn't matter. And it's true that there's a huge number of people. It's one of the big arguments for a wealth tax against an income tax, simply because a lot of very, very rich people who don't have hardly any income and are living entirely off their wealth. And that's going to get worse over time, or more serious issue over time.
And a question here from Robin Garrett. Do you ascribe any contributing factors to the 1996 Clinton welfare reform that limited income support to 5 years?
We haven't thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at the time thinking that there would be a day of reckoning for that exact move. It's a really great question, and we haven't followed that, but we will. That's a really good question.
There are lots of different policy levers. And I know people have talked also a lot about how different states regulated opioids in different ways. And were you able to see the effect of that in your work?
Nope.
No. The rise of opioid deaths.
You're fighting against Purdue Pharma, that's corrupting politics in Washington. And every time anyone tries to rein them in, they buy off some congressman and it gets stopped. And so, I think the harm was certainly in the areas where despair was highest. And that's where the pharma companies, particularly Purdue, targeted doctors and patients in that place. But I mean, this is an insane system that actually allows, one family to make $12 billion off addicting and killing people, and allows its most famous and one of its much beloved pharma companies to have a subsidiary that's growing opium poppies in Tasmania to fuel the epidemic, while the American Air Force is bombing opium growing in Helmand province in Afghanistan. I mean, what sort of world are we living in?
That is an extraordinary contrast right there. Okay, last question from Lisa Jordan with the Steelworkers. It's clear that the decline in manufacturing and unionization has impacted the wage growth of those who are dying of despair. What role do you think unions can play in re-empowering this population, giving people voice and hope of a better life. Did you consider suggesting empowering unions as one of your proposals to turn the trend around?
That is a really heavy lift. I don't know how we bring unions back. I think, as Angus said a little bit earlier, like getting workers to act collectively is a great idea. We have to figure out how to do it. And it's going to take some out of the box thinkers to figure that out. But they have to have a voice at the table. They don't have a voice at the table. The social contract has been ripped, and we need really good people, hopefully some of the people online here, to be thinking about how we make that happen.
This crisis should enable people who believe in collective action, and it's important.
And I have one little piece of good news, which is that there is a bill that's passed the House of Representatives now called the PRO Act, that is, a labor law reform bill for the 21st century, and there's also one for the public sector. So those bills are moving. They did pass the House of Representatives. It's gone to an early death in the Senate, but hopefully that bill and the energy behind it and the lessons that people are learning from the current crisis and the dangers, as you all have said, of having excess power concentrated in too few hands and too few voices, maybe will help both propel the kind of people who will vote for the PRO Act in the next Congress and a national leader who will support something along those lines.
We wish you every bit of luck.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne and Angus, for joining us this afternoon. And thanks to all of our listeners, our participants. Sorry we weren't able to get to more questions, but I really appreciate all of you joining and putting your questions in. And I hope you will go ahead and buy the book. It's Deaths of Despair, The Future of Capitalism. And there will be a link to the publisher after the webinar is over. So just any last words, Angus and Anne, thank you so much for having been here with us this afternoon.
Thank you for this wonderful audience.
Yeah,
It's
and hopefully once the clouds have lifted a bit, we can come visit you in Washington, because there's a lot we need to know that we know you all are working on, since I teach a lot of the papers that have come out of EPI, and it's the strongest evidence. So you guys are doing fabulous work, and thank you for that.
Thank you so much. We look forward to hosting you in Washington at some point in the future.
Terrific. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.